I keep thinking you'll come on back to me.
Every web design organization has a core curriculum of 5 types of meetings: getting started, checking in, presenting, exploring, and the big finish. Get ready to explore how each meeting is an opportunity to do your best work from the author of the forthcoming book, Meeting Design. Please welcome Kevin Hoffman.
Hey, how are you? Listen, let's stand up. Everybody stand up. I know it's irritating when people ask you to do this. Go ahead, stand up. I'm going to ask you to do something. So I want to thank Corey, Carla, Carrie, Dean, and Joe, and everybody at Blend Interactive for putting on this conference. So let's give them a round of applause. So amazing speakers, really good stuff. I've been sitting down front the whole time. I've really enjoyed it. So you can sit. Just wanted you to stretch out a little bit. So I'm going to talk about meetings. I know that some people hate meetings, some people love meetings. I think there is a tremendous opportunity to change the way that we work by looking at how we build meetings themselves. How are they built, and why do they go wrong, and why do they go right? And I think it all starts with the beliefs that we carry into the room with us, right? Those beliefs, they drive what happens before a meeting, they drive what happens during a meeting, and what happens after a meeting. And it's important to think about, are these beliefs helping us have better meetings? Are they helping us get more done? Are they helping us have the kind of meetings that my friend Rebecca was talking about, where we're actually building a better culture? Are they getting in the way of our process? Now, I've had a lot of beliefs in my life. This is me right there. That's me when I was probably 10. And I didn't practice any spiritual beliefs at that age. My family wasn't very spiritually active, never was. But I had this one belief that I want to share with you. So you guys might be familiar with this sign. It might be, around here, it might be elk, I think, or some other woodland creature, right? But I want you to, in your own mind, not out loud, just look at this sign and read it to yourself. You know, what does this sign say? I used to believe that crossing was pronounced zing. Anybody else believe that? Yeah, there's hands. I see hands. There's some zingers here. I know there's some of you. And I know that we're not alone, you and me, that we believed this, because there was this great show on NPR, an episode of This American Life, where they talked about odd beliefs that we develop when we're younger that we kind of carry with us into adulthood. And if they go unchallenged, we never really revisit them, right? You know, my belief in that existence of the word zing was just something I picked up along the way and never really came up until actually I heard this show last year on This American Life, and I was like, oh, it's not a word. Who knew? You know, the only place it is a word is, I think, on Batman, right? That's definitely where zing is a word. But what about unicorns? Anybody here believe in unicorns? Yeah? I mean, not you want to believe in unicorns. I want to believe in unicorns. But you believe they were real and they existed and maybe they've gone extinct. Like this girl, I bet she believes in unicorns, right? She's got to believe in unicorns. It turns out there was a woman in her 30s who also believed in unicorns, and she went to a dinner party. This was on this NPR episode. She went to a dinner party, and she was talking about the plight of the unicorn in Africa and how they were going extinct, and it was really hard to find them. Everybody laughed because they thought she was joking. But then they stopped laughing because they realized that she wasn't. And it was really sad. But these beliefs, you can carry them until they go challenged by a social experience like that, or by experiences we have that make us revisit what we think. Our beliefs about meetings, they come from somewhere, right? They don't just appear. They come from that first job we get. We get a job out of college or right out of high school. We get our first job. We develop beliefs and collect skills that help us make value out of our meetings. And then we take those skills to our next job and our next job, and we kind of keep those beliefs with us, iterating along the way, maybe a little bit here and there. And if we're lucky enough to go from being a maker to a manager, then we carry those beliefs up with us. These are some of the greatest hits of beliefs about meetings. Maybe you have some of these beliefs. One thing that I think is very common in our field in digital design or marketing is this idea that, user experience designers or designers, they love having meetings. They love doing the kind of workshops that Rebecca was talking about, while developers don't like to have meetings. And these are beliefs that may or may not be necessarily be true. One of my favorites is this one, this last one here. The meetings are great at my company. Lots of people think that they have pretty good meetings, but everywhere else meetings are bad. Beliefs we have about meetings are a lot like what a fish believes about water. A fish, it doesn't need to understand water in any meaningful way. But as a fish grows, as a fish goes through life, the water, it places limits on his ability to move and his ability to breathe and his ability to get to what he wants to get to. And a fish knows nothing of water. A fish doesn't understand what water is, but it governs everything that's possible in his world, right? Until it doesn't, right? Life finds a way, right? Eventually, fish, it takes a long time, but they evolve the ability to get out of water. In fact, we're all technically fish, depending on what you believe. But if meetings need to change, and they can, to be more productive, to tell better stories, just to be more dense and have more content, they can change. But I think there's a way to go about making that change, whether you're in charge or you're not. There's a way to get at fixing meetings in an organization. It takes time, it takes effort, but the first step is by treating meetings as a design problem. Now, this morning, Jonathan was talking about wicked problems, right? He was talking about this idea of these very big problems. And I think design problems are probably a few steps down than something like nuclear waste. But we throw this term around, a design problem. We talk about design thinking and design method. We don't really, I don't think we really talk enough about what exactly is a design problem. These are two things I think that help us realize we have a design problem. Number one, a design problem is a problem that can be solved with a demonstration of intention. Meaning, if you try to solve this problem, you have the ability to express your own tastes or your perspective or something unique about what you think makes your solution better than another solution. And another thing that is evidence of a design problem is something that is constrained. In other words, there's not an unlimited way of solving these problems. There are things, constraining factors, that force you to approach the problem in the particular way. So let's look at meetings. If we think about a meeting in our brains, we're usually thinking about a room like this one, right? And there's a lot of intention in the design of this experience. People are seated facing each other. They're not facing screens. They're not facing content. There's a lot of open light. The intention here is comfort and conversation, right? Now contrast that with the intention in this room. A little different, right? A little more sad. But there's nothing here, and if this is your office, I'm really sorry. Like one of these days I'll put this on the screen and be like, that's my office. But there's nothing here you can't do that you could also do in the other room. There's a shared surface. There's chairs where they're facing each other. But the intention here is probably necessity. They're trying to talk about, they just needed a place to talk about the scary basement work that they do in this scary basement, right? Here's another meeting. It's a wrestling match or a boxing match. It's loaded with intention. They're trying to manifest conflict intentionally. Maybe it's staged conflict, but it's still conflict. And there's somebody whose job it is to be aware of how that conflict plays out and what the rules are. And there's a lot there that you can take and apply to meetings in the workplace. Whose job is it to mediate conflict, and what are the rules? And are we going to change those rules from time to time? Here's another meeting that I like. Whose intentions are here? The intentions of the composer, the intentions of the musicians. A meeting is a blend of a lot of different intentions, of everybody in the room, and the intentions of the people that called the meeting. And there's a lot of range of intention in the way we approach meetings, right? There's a lot of range between the scary basement and the idea of a whole orchestra. Now, Matt talked about culture affecting our content. And you can bet that culture definitely affects our meetings. I think culture, corporate culture, and culture of our workplaces is a theme today. Every organization in which we work, it has a culture. And culture is that water. Culture is what governs what is and isn't possible in a group. And both good and bad aspects of meetings kind of manifest themselves in culture. Do people interrupt all the time? Is discussion very loose or is it very rigid? Those are aspects of culture that put limits on what's possible in a meeting, but it also gives you the space to experiment and figure out what you can change. A meeting is also constrained by time. We say we want to get to a certain goal in a certain amount of time, but time does not care whether or not we get to that goal. So that's another constraint on meetings. Ideas themselves are a constraint on meetings. Figuring out how many ideas are we going to explore in a meeting, and how well are my ideas aligned with your ideas while we're talking? Do we have the same idea really? Getting that alignment. When a group of people are really aligned on an idea, really cool stuff can happen, but it takes effort to get that alignment. And the biggest constraint of all, and the one I'm probably going to talk about a little more, is the human brain, right? This is the biggest constraint on meetings. The human brains are these really powerful computers that can do amazing things, but they're also more effective with certain patterns, and they're very easily deceived. I'm going to talk about a few ways in which our brains are deceived in meetings. So meetings definitely check all those criteria for being a design problem. But we don't treat meetings like design problems. We put really limited forethought into agendas a lot of the time. And we don't iterate on our approaches. A lot of meetings become habit for us. They kind of work their way under our skin. And they just become these rote things that we do. I've found that in helping organizations that I've consulted with and in my own projects and the design projects that I've run, helping them start to treat meetings as a design problem, approach them with design, it helps to think about these 5 genres, these 5 basic things that we do. Meetings where we're starting a process, meetings where we're presenting a concept or findings or a design, meetings in the middle, meetings that are technically exploring, where we're trying to get somewhere, and meetings at the end, where we wrap up stuff and try to make meaning out of the work that we've done. And while I explore all of these meetings, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the constraints that pop up in each one and ways specifically to handle those. So this is the Now What conference. When I think about now what, I think about I've already launched a thing. I'm not at the beginning. But really every ending is a beginning, if you think about it. And that's kind of the point of this conference, as I understand it. The point is, you've done something, but you're really just getting started. And I want to talk about an organization that had a similar problem. This is Central Park. And they launched a really successful website, but they had a problem almost immediately. This is the site. They had a little bit of that field of dreams problem that Misty was talking about, this idea that, if we just build this website, we'll suddenly get donations, especially if we put red donation buttons on the page. They were assuming they would be able to get donations. But what they did was they assumed that as a park, we need to build our content around tourism, around people who visit the park from outside of New York City. And that particular relationship was not enough to stimulate donation. The kind of donations they really wanted to get were donations that were from people who lived around the park, people who used the park every day or every weekend. So they asked my company to develop some personas, to do some research with people who lived around the park and develop a better understanding of the kinds of content and functionality and experience they could have digitally that would deepen their relationship with the park and make them donate. So we presented these personas just this week on Monday. We went into the offices in Central Park, and we did this interesting thing. Instead of presenting personas as amalgams of kind of demographic data points, like it's a woman or a man and they're in this age bracket or they're a college student or whatever. We just presented them as arcs. This is the series of behaviors and feelings and expectations that somebody has using your website or your product. And the reason we did this, I'll tell you in a second. After we presented the basic personas that we came up with, we gave everybody a blank arc. And we said, okay, here's your persona right here. What's all the different kinds of content and functionality that would support each step in this arc? You know, how could we best support that process? And our goal for this meeting, it wasn't for us to argue that the personas were worthy. We think we did a pretty good job of that. Our goal was to get the design team and the content team at the Central Park Conservancy to actually start using these in making decisions about their content, to actually think about these different kinds of park users. And it was a great way to get started at the beginning to refine a strategy or to revisit a strategy. And it was successful for two reasons. Number one, we presented these personas as arcs instead of those data points. And that did something interesting. If I say to you, a woman who is 25, who is in graduate school, there are all these assumptions about that pop into your head based on what you know about those particular demographic points. But if I say to you, a person who runs, all you know is that they're a runner. So by presenting personas this way, by removing all of those data points and just talking about behavior, we were removing assumptions from the meeting. We're taking those assumptions right out. Indy Young posted this tweet a while ago, I think in March, and it created a ton of provocative discussion about personas. But the thing I immediately learned was, oh wow, you know, I could actually get people to focus on what I learned in research if I take things out that make them think assumptions that they might be carrying into the room. And the second thing is, we did a lot of visual listening. During this meeting, we created these personas as a visual representation of behavior, as opposed to describing them as lists of things, you know, just talking through. And the thing about our brains is our brains listen just as well, if not even better, with our eyes than they do with our ears. Our brains are the way we use our eyes in listening is really powerful, and there's tons of evidence for this in meetings. If you think about a meeting that's going really poorly, eventually somebody will get up and start to write or draw on a whiteboard. And they'll do that because they want to add that element of visual listening. And the meetings that go really well, the ones where the kind you see with all the Post-it notes or really good sketches or whatever, we photograph those things right away because that's the evidence of our conversation. And we want that later to make better decisions. The visuals help complex arguments become simpler. They break them into pieces. Complex systems are more easily understood with visuals. This is an example of a complex system. This is Walt Disney's business model in 1957. It's how they stole your parents' money and your grandparents' money in 1957. And if you imagine what it's like, you're on the board of Walt Disney and you're sitting in a meeting and you're like, you know, where are we going to put our money? Are we going to build a new park? Are we going to add a new character? You can follow all the different ways in which they're making money off of different products much more easily than you could with something spoken or something written, you know? Seeing things visualized as sketches or flow diagrams, even simple cartoons, it helps us form deeper, more complex, and stronger, longer-lasting memories, things that are not possible without a visual. Just, they're impossible. And there's this really simple hack that I do in most meetings that I have that takes advantage of this. One of the problems that I think everybody says they have in meetings is people are looking at their phones, people are looking at their laptops, people are distracted. They're in their own personal space. Instead of handing out agendas, what I do is I actually do a visual agenda. This is an example of the agenda that we had for that workshop. A visual agenda is just a way of visualizing what we're going to do for the next X number of minutes. And by drawing this and putting it up on the wall in a central place, it actually, pun intended, draws people together around the same thing. A printed agenda, you put that in front of someone, it's doing the same thing that their phone or their laptop is doing. It's drawing them into their own personal space. And that's the opposite of what we want to do, right? So, I talked about meeting number 1, beginnings. I want to review really quick. Number 1, we want to actively choose a way to present information or to get started that manages the assumptions that people bring into a process, right? If you're working with personas, the more you give places for people to make assumptions, the more they will make. So you don't want to spend your whole meeting talking about assumptions. You want to talk about what you really know. And second, visuals are great for everything. Making visuals and having visuals in advance makes a huge difference to get at what you need to get to. And I think the place we use visuals the most is in presentations, right? One of the meetings that I've struggled with over the years, and I've been doing digital design for about 25 years, is this idea of presentations. Because when I got started in design, the way I learned to do presentations was wrong. I learned a bad habit, a way of doing things, and that habit was this. I figured if I did something right in one presentation, that I could take that technique and apply it to every other presentation that I give. But I'm not presenting the same content to the same people over and over and over, right? It's always going to be a different audience. So that was a habit I had to break. And one place that you see this habit kind of manifest and also break is in television. I love television. Does anybody here like television? Yeah, a couple, you can raise your hand, it's cool. You can admit it, we're among friends. I love television. I love getting invested in characters and whether or not the decisions they make are believable or you know, if the things they're confronted with, what I would do in those situations. It's a very easy way to start a conversation with me if you want to talk to me. Just pick a show that we both watch. This is a good example. Megan just was talking earlier about being a story-first person, right? This idea that we're story first. We're not print first or web first. We are hardwired to be deeply invested in story. We all see ourselves as the protagonist in millions of stories that happen throughout our lives. And this is from a book called, oh, you can't see it, it's cut off. This is from a book called The User's Journey by Donna Lacaw, and this is a basic structure for story. This is what draws me and maybe you into a lot of TV. This idea that we have a beginning and a middle and an end in a story. And that during a story, we might have a little bit of rising tension or excitement in the beginning, and then it goes up really steeply to a high point, and then something changes, and we get a resolution. Unless it's like True Blood, and there's a cliffhanger at the end, which is really irritating, right? But the reason that works is because you're invested in going back up here and getting back to the bottom again. That's what makes you watch the next episode. And presentations, really good presentations, are stories. You're trying to tell a story. The thing that I learned to do was the real estate tour. Is anybody familiar with the real estate tour? The real estate tour is where you walk people through your designs, one item or one box or one piece of content at a time. And you say, well, we put this here for this reason. We put that there for this reason. And that is a terrible story. It is a really boring story, unless you're presenting to designers, because you're describing the story of how you made design decisions. But if you're presenting to stakeholders, or even better, you're presenting to a mix of users and different kinds of people, a better way to structure a presentation of a design is story. One of my clients is a university, one of the top engineering schools in the world right now. And we were trying to present a very unconventional design direction to them, trying to get them to get away from a lot of the traditions in higher ed web design and make a case, a really logical case for doing something different. So what we did was we built a story around that case. We developed empathy for users by creating a fake Google search screen. We just made this up. We said, well, what if somebody is searching for robot legs? You know, what would happen? And then we showed the page that they would land on, because this school is actually building robotic legs for athletes. Total cyborg stuff. Very cool stuff. And then we kind of walked people further into the story of the user. It's like, oh, well, what is this? This is health and biomedicine. That's what they call it at this particular institution. So how would I go about actually majoring in that and building some cool-ass robotic legs? And approaching it this way, it actually got them to buy into the design direction much faster than if we had just walked them through each screen, home page to subpage to third level page. That would have been a terrible way to approach this. And the reason it worked is because a good presentation works like a story. It can be designed to include all the elements of story, beginnings and middles and endings, and actions and motivations of the users, or motivations of the people in the story. The other thing that we did with this particular meeting was we actually were treating this presentation as a design problem. Okay, so I talked about knowing what a design problem is. This is how you solve a design problem. This is the basic structure of design thinking. It's often credited to Tim Brown at IDEO, but a lot of people have taken credit for this. It means that there's a situation that merits research. There's complexity. So you research it, you consider multiple approaches, and then you ship one approach and you test it, and then you reflect on what worked or what didn't and why it didn't work. And that's what we did this presentation. Well, that's what we did with this presentation, rather. And it sounds like a lot of work. It sounds like, oh, you mean every time we have a presentation, we got to go through these steps? But it's really not that hard, and it's kind of baked into our processes already. First of all, we researched the problem, right? The design isn't working. That was the problem. And there are reasons. There are business reasons. When Rebecca was talking about building a business case, this is that business case building before the presentation. So we developed an understanding of the principles and the brand and the business goals that they needed to meet. And the solution that we wanted was the client would approve this design. So first, we came up with a bunch of different approaches. You know, we could present this way or this way or this way. And then we made the presentation informally a few times. We iterated to tighten up that story. After that, we presented the design direction, and the design direction was approved. And we talked about why it was approved, what went well and what didn't well. We immediately had a conversation about that after the presentation. So, presentations, meeting number 2. 2 things I talked about. The first one, story, story, and also story. Story makes a big difference when you're trying to make a case for work that you've done. And not the story of your work, not the story of the decisions that you made, but the story of the thing, the story of the people the thing is meant to serve, the users of a design, the visitors of a site. That's the story you need to tell. And second, a great way to improve presentations is to iterate into better presentations, to keep revisiting how you approach each one and come back to it over and over. And that brings us to the middle of my talk and kind of the middle meeting. The middle meetings are kind of the ones that are like the death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? They're the ones that kind of feel like they take forever, but they're also the gasoline that keeps the engine running. Some people call them oxygen meetings. And in the last 3 or 4 years, I've had a really interesting change in the way that I approach these meetings that's been brought about primarily by technology. All of these companies are fully distributed. Companies like Envision and Automatic that builds WordPress and 18F, which is a big part of our government that designs our websites and government sites, federal government, and design agencies like mine and lots of others. They're fully distributed companies. They're companies that have decided that they don't want the overhead of an office or the commute to work to lose that time, that we trust each other to get work done, but we still need to meet. And one of the criticisms of these kinds of companies is like, well, how do they know what each other's doing? How do they keep informed? How do they stay aware? At my company, we do 3 meetings. There are 3 kinds of meetings we have for check-ins for every project we have. We have a daily asynchronous check-in. We have a weekly project check-in for the team. And we have a weekly project check-in for the client. And each one of them works a little differently. The first one, the asynchronous check-in, that's not really a meeting. It's just a conversation that we have in a tool like Slack or HipChat or Basecamp, any real-time chat tool that we share. And every day between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. at some point, everybody has to post 3 things. Number 1, what did you do yesterday? What did you work on? What did you finish? Number 2, what are you going to do today? And number 3, what's going to keep you from getting that done? What are the things that you don't know or the things you don't have that you need to be able to finish that work? And this has replaced our daily stand-ups. We don't have to meet every day. Because if I see that somebody is blocked by something that I can remove, I can fix, then we don't need to have a meeting to figure that out. Now, the second kind of meeting we have is the check-in meetings with our clients and the weekly check-in meetings with the staff of the particular project. And those meetings are entirely optional. The only 2 people that have to be there are me and my project manager, and the client if it's the meeting with the client. They're as long as necessary. So we might meet for 10 seconds and say, hey, guess what? We don't need to meet. Or we might meet for 2 hours, and we'll say, we're going to focus on this specific problem for 2 hours. And we use a lean coffee agenda. Now, you might say to me, Kevin, because that's my name, you might say, Kevin, is a lean coffee what I think it is? Is a lean coffee a low-calorie version of a fat coffee that makes meetings better? And I would say to you, no, it is not that. Lean coffee is just a series of steps, right? It's a series of steps that you follow to manage a particular constraint of ideas. How ideas are handled in meetings. And this is how it works. Rebecca mentioned Mural. We use a tool called Board Thing. We use that tool because I'm building it with some friends of mine. But there's Mural, there's Board Thing, there's Cardboard. There's about 10 of these tools right now. It's a shared whiteboarding tool, right? Just a blank screen, and it's just like putting sticky notes on a board. And what the first thing we do in Lean Coffee is we say who's here and who's not. And by using color, if somebody comes back later and adds their information, we can see, oh, this is what Dan wanted to add to the discussion. And we ask usually one question: what do you want to talk about? How are we going to use this status meeting? If you need to kind of focus in on a specific thing, like from the dailies, oh, we really need to focus on the fact that this one particular stakeholder is concerned about content related to departments. We might add a few more questions. Like for the design presentation, the one that I just showed you from that university. This was actually the meeting of the planning of that presentation, where we planned how we wanted to present. And we asked 3 questions. What are your goals for this presentation? What could go wrong during this presentation? And what outcomes does this project need? And this is where we ended up. Everybody kind of added all the things that they wanted to see. And the great thing was, we spent 5 or 10 minutes just adding all of this. Then we worked through it, and it allows us to build the agenda for the actual presentation. So we iterated right into the agenda just by dragging these things over into the time constraints that we had. And this does the thing that Rebecca was talking about with ideas, where you start with the faucet and then you actually refine and start to exercise judgment. It's a great way to manage ideas. If you want to learn about Lean Coffee, this would be the website to go to for Lean Coffee. It's a good way to do meetups too, if you do local meetups around shared interests. But it deals with that question of how many ideas are we going to talk about during this meeting and which ones? And it gives you a way to keep that on time. The reason it works is because you're following a pattern, and this is that pattern. You're trying to, a meeting, the job of a meeting is to get you to a decision. And then you take those decisions and hopefully they stay in your brain and you act on them eventually, right? In order to do that, we have to first build ideas and then constrain into some sort of decision. And Lean Coffee is a great way to make that happen. So meetings. I talked about meetings in the middle. First of all, even if you don't work into a distributed office, maybe your company's not distributed, maybe they let you work from home, maybe they don't. But regardless, thinking about eliminating daily meetings or check-in meetings and replacing them with something asynchronous could save you a lot of time. And it's a really effective way to create the kind of connections between people without having to get everybody in the same room, because that's expensive. And second, it's okay if you don't always have an agenda. I'm not saying you have to design a robust agenda for every meeting that you have, but you have to have a way to get there that shows some intention. And Lean Coffee is one way of getting to an emergent agenda, allowing an agenda to form on its own. So that brings us to explorations. This idea that we're exploring. When you think about an explorer, we think about going out into the wilderness. We think about climbing a mountain, right? This is Edmund Hillary. Edmund Hillary was the first recorded individual to climb the summit of Mount Everest. Interesting thing about exploring in this fashion, going to the top of a mountain, there are a couple things you have to do. You're not just actually wandering around, like the term exploring implies. You have to plan exactly how much you're going to do at a particular interval, like today we're going to get this far or get to this elevation. And the really important thing is you have to have enough supplies and enough forethought to get back to where you started. That's a really important part of exploring. And I think if you think about exploration meetings, you often think about circular conversation and meetings that keep going and going and going. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about intentional exploration. So you actually get back to where you started. One of my friends is James Macanufo. James here has a beard. He looks like he's ready to explore. James has this rule that he uses to plan workshops. James has written a fantastic book on workshops that has really specific agendas for workshops. So if you're looking for workshop ideas, the book is called Game Storming. It's written by James and a person named Dave Gray and another person named Sonny Brown. But I'm not going to tell you, run this particular workshop. I'm going to tell you how James actually designs workshops, how he actually comes up with approaches to workshops. And one of the things he uses is called the 96 rule. I call it the 96-6 rule because I added another 6. I felt like it needed more 6. So I added another one. This is the 96-6 rule. 90 minutes at a time on any one thing. After 90 minutes, it's time to move on to something else or take a break. 6 ideas at a stretch. That's what I added because it's 6 and it fits in. And 6 people in a group. So if you have a big meeting, you have a big workshop, you want to break into groups of 6. Now, why do you want to do this? It has to do with memories. The way your brain makes memories. When we have a meeting, it's all about sharing ideas and making new ideas. And our hope is that those ideas move into our brains and they walk out of the room, and then we actually do something based on the agreements or the ideas that we came up with. In order for that to work, we have to make some memories. I'm not talking about the memories we're going to make at these parties that we're going to have. And in about 30 minutes, we're going to go have some beers. We're going to make some memories. Those are fun memories. But I'm talking actually about biochemical creation of memories, how your brain creates memories. There are 4 stages of memories. If you think about how memory works, there's actually 4 stages. There's what's called sensory memory, which is you touch a thing and you're like, I remember how that felt. There's intermediate memory. There's actually working memory, then there's intermediate memory, and then there's long-term memory, the stuff that you remember for most of your life. And each one kind of feeds into the next one. And a lot of different kinds of studies, both biochemical studies of the brain and also cognitive studies of how we learn, have showed us a little bit about how the brain works and creates memories. So I'm going to focus on working memory specifically. First of all, working memory, it only lasts for about 30 seconds. So this is the kind of memory that's doing all the heavy lifting in meetings. This is the memory that I can't come up with a weightlifting metaphor. I'm really sorry, I'm not a weightlifter. I would for Megan, but I can't. But this is the one that's working the hardest during a meeting. And the interesting thing about working memory, not everybody has the same capacity and not everybody's working memory works the same way. People who have attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, their working memories work very differently than other people's working memories. But the capacity ranges, it's not always 30 seconds. Sometimes it's a little less, sometimes it's a little more. Some type of people can remember more in their working memory, some people remember less. So meetings have to accommodate different levels of working memory. The other thing that's really interesting about working memory is there are 2 processes going on every second. There are always 2 things going on. On the one side is the phonological loop, and the other side is the visual spatial sketch pad. These are really fancy ways of saying that the way we are making meaning out of what we hear and the way we make meaning out of what we see are always happening at the same time, and they're separate, but they serve each other, okay? People who have had serious brain damage and accidents or from whatever caused that brain damage, it's shown that one of these processes can continue when the other one breaks. And when they're both working well together in a meeting, it makes a big difference. And that's why those visuals are so important. And then intermediate memories are the memories that last longer. And that's where the 90 minutes come in. Intermediate memories last longer than 90 minutes. So those are the memories that actually walk out the door. Those are the memories we leave the room with, okay? And those memories are actually a function of a chemical changing in your brain. When you're creating a memory that lasts that long, there's actually proteins that are combining in your brain. And there are things that help that happen. So if you think about that session lasting 90 minutes, those working memories are firing every 30 seconds or so, depending on who you're dealing with. And the intermediate memories are slowly being created over time. What we want to do is allow as many things to move from working memory to intermediate memory as possible. And in order to do that, we have to use both oral and visual listening, both eyes and ears during meetings, and we need to have enough time for reflection and discussion. And that's where the 6 ideas come in, right? That reflection and discussion, and specifically organizing things into 6 ideas at a time, is really powerful. That's what helps also cement those memories. In about 10 minutes, and this is from a lot of studies done in colleges of how people learn, in about 10 minutes, you can keep in your brain about 6 different concepts, or 5 or 6, depending on which study you read. But in order to make those to make those ideas stick, you also need another 10 minutes of reflection and discussion immediately after you learn those 6 things. So if you think about 6 ideas at a time, in about 90 minutes, you can cover about 24 ideas. That would be 80 minutes for 20 minutes, 20 minutes, 20 minutes, and 20 minutes. That's a really good way of organizing content over a workshop, over a discussion. We're going to cover about 24, 25 things. How are we going to break these into 6-piece chunks and then, have discussions in that time? And then why 6 people? That's the last rule. When you're having a workshop or planning a big exploration, you want to have 6 people at a time, right? The reason you want to do that is because of alignment. 2 people in a meeting, 1 point of alignment. But if you add people, it's not just adding one more point, it's adding point after point after point. And it actually gets really complicated when we get to this size. So we want to keep it at about 6. And if you have 10 people, break into 2 groups of 5. It makes a lot of sense. So that's explorations. 90 minutes, 6 ideas at a time, and 6 people in a group. That's, I think, the most valuable thing to designing explorations. And that brings us to the end, right? You finished a project and you're in a position to make a lot of value, but I think a lot of us don't have postmortems. We actually decide not to have those postmortems. And this happens, I think, because of something in our brain called the creativity bias. Have you ever been in a meeting where you throw out a really crazy idea? You're like, you know what? I'm going to blow your minds. I'm going to throw out this crazy idea. And the first person that hears it says, whoa, 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 whoa. We're not going crazy here. Take it easy. That thing that happens in their brain is called the creativity bias. And it's triggered by a fear of change that evolved into our brains because we want to stay part of a group. We're wired to preserve our status in a group. So when somebody throws out something that's really different or really original or creative, our brains say, oh, they're going to get kicked out of the group. We don't want to associate with that because we want to survive by staying in a group. But it actually serves to remove good ideas from discussion. And in order to manage that, I use something called the plus delta. The plus delta is a great way to organize a postmortem or really a retrospective if you do Agile or any kind of thing. A plus delta, what it allows you to do is say, we're going to talk about the things that worked first, but then we're going to talk about the things that we need to change. It creates a safe space for talking about changing things up. It's explicit in saying that, so it kind of tricks that part of the brain that fears that change. Now, I think it's one of the things that's really interesting about Agile process is that plus delta is kind of built into Agile process. This is basic Agile process. I'm not here to defend or sell Agile process, but I think Agile meetings are really interesting because that plus delta is built in. We list the wins, we list the problems we had, we list all the changes we want to make, and then we post and discuss those changes. Now, the other thing that we fear during meetings at the end of a process, it's not from the creativity bias. It's actually entirely different. It's this crazy thing called getting fired, right? Where we're going to be in a meeting where we're talking about what went wrong in a project, and somebody's going to point their finger at us and say, you know what? It's your fault that this happened. You're fired, or at least we don't like you anymore, and eventually we will fire you. And that is a legitimate fear. That's a real thing, right? Etsy has a great way of managing this fear. Etsy, their approach to post-mortem meetings, when they end a sprint or a project, they do something called a blameless post-mortem. And it's based on the concept of a just culture. A just culture which assumes that whatever you do, you are trying to do the right thing. It's not your fault. So we're going to unpack why you made the decisions you made. We're going to talk about the actions you took, what you observed happened when you took those actions, what you actually expected to happen, and what the assumptions you were making were. And that's it. That's what we do in our postmortem, and then really talk about what we observed that happened. And sadly, that brings us to the end of endings. This idea that, first of all, we structure ending discussions around positives and changes, plus delta. It's really easy to remember plus delta. I use it in almost all of my workshops. At the end, I'll say what worked and what didn't. And then if you want, you can use this blameless approach to postmortems like Etsy uses. If you Google blameless postmortems, you'll find all of Etsy's articles on that. And that brings us to the end. I wanted to share all these ideas with you because I feel like there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure in our jobs every day to kind of innovate, to come up with new things, to solve problems better. And that pressure is constant, and it's terrible, and it takes this really specific form. It takes the form of the stegoceratops. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Probably not. Probably you're all like, should I laugh? Is this like the unicorn thing that he believes that this is a real thing? The stegoceratops, I think, represents how people want us to innovate. A lot of our stakeholders, a lot of my clients, when they think about innovation, they think about combining two things that previously weren't combined to build a better business model, It's this instinct like saying, we're going to design Uber, but it'll be like for cats, right? So that's not really innovation, right? That's what I would call novelty. And that's not to say it's a bad thing. This is an example of novelty. For those of you who write HTML, this was a novel way of getting actual good typography to appear on websites before they came up with a better way. But this was so used universally throughout the web that they had to come up with a better way. And the way they came up with, the first one, at least one of the first ones, was Typekit. Typekit wasn't originally an Adobe product. Typekit was a company started by 3 people in a meeting. They got together over a weekend, and they planned out all of the pieces of Typekit, what the business model was going to be, and how they were going to approach the JavaScript piece of this, and what fonts they would be able to start with. All of that kind of came together in a meeting. One of my favorite beliefs about the relationship between meetings and the cultures in which we work, it came from this experience that I had with my mom. Sadly, my mom passed away in 2008, and she had a long battle with lung cancer. And right at the moment of her death, there was this hospice nurse that was working with us. And she burst into this religious fervor. It was the most unexpected thing. It was this incredibly tragic, grieving moment that we were having. And she kind of jumped in with this big religious ceremony that we weren't expecting. But I knew, all of us knew, that she thought she was doing the right thing. She thought she was doing the best thing for the situation at hand. And no matter what kind of conflict arises in work, or what kind of conflict comes up with clients, or however you approach your job, the one belief that I have, and I try to keep every meeting I walk into, is no matter what someone says, they believe that they're trying to make things better. And it's much more important to unpack their logic than it is to try to disprove the thing that they believe. I feel like meetings where we really align and improve our work, make better designs, come up with better campaigns, get better content strategy, those are those meetings where we're actually getting that openness and that trust that Rebecca was talking about, right? And that is a powerful way to get things done and really start to develop love for what you do. And with that, I want to say thank you for your valuable time today. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you hanging out until the end. And I hope I see you at the party. I would love to chat with you about your meetings and the things that drive you nuts. And if there's something that I didn't cover, please tell me about it because I'd love to put it in my book. All right? So thank you so much. I appreciate it.